had to do with others. They seem to all be nuclear testing. We have more nuclear weapons than anybody. We don't do testing. You know, we've halted it many years ago. But with others doing testing, I think it's appropriate that we do also.
On February 5, the last standing guardrail on U.S.-Russia strategic nuclear forces hit its legal end date. That treaty was New START, and the White House framed the moment like a reset button, a chance for Donald Trump to demand a better deal on his timetable. But the real story is not only about a treaty expiring, it is about what remains when two nuclear rivals keep observing limits after expiry, and what disappears when inspections, data exchanges, and enforceable ceilings turn into voluntary habits. In that gap, risk becomes policy. Donald Trump treated New START like a negotiator's prop, not a functioning restraint. According to public reporting, he had been publicly dismissive of the deadline, saying the United States would do a better agreement and signaling that if the treaty expired, it expired. According to Reuters, when Russia proposed a one-year voluntary extension of the central deployment limits to buy time, Trump rejected that offer and instead called for nuclear experts to draft a new, improved, and modernized treaty. New START could only be extended once under its text, and that extension was already used in 2021. According to Reuters, the treaty's value was never only the number 1,550 deployed strategic warheads, or the cap on delivery systems. It was the stable framework that forced routine notification, data exchange, and on-site verification. Once the treaty reaches expiry, the law does not convert those obligations into a permanent habit. They become choices. This is where the blind spot forms. Trump's decision-making assumes leverage can be created by removing the guardrails first and negotiating later. But removing guardrails also removes the structured channel that makes reassurance credible. According to Reuters, without a replacement deal, both sides are free to add forces over time, and each side is pushed to plan around worst-case assumptions about what the other is building. Even if technical and logistical realities slow any immediate surge, the incentives change at once. Verification fades, suspicion hardens, and planners start drafting build-up options. The institutional constraint is simple and unforgiving. Without a signed successor, neither Washington nor Moscow is bound by treaty enforcement. The White House can signal intent, but intent is not a verification regime. The narrowing of options begins here, because rebuilding procedures requires time, diplomacy, and legal architecture. Each day without binding terms raises the cost of returning to limits and deepens the temptation to treat nuclear posture as a short-term bargaining chip. The pressure is moving in one direction, and it does not favor improvisation. Every statement now lands inside a world with fewer enforceable restraints. The phrase that matters now is not extension, it is observation. According to Reuters, Axios reported that U.S. and Russian officials were closing in on a plan to keep observing New START's limits for an additional period, possibly 6 months, even though the treaty would still formally expire. Axios described the arrangement as not legally formalized, a good faith commitment while talks begin on a successor. Reuters added that it was unclear whether any commitment would be written down in a way that could be enforced. In other words, the deal being discussed is a political promise, not a legal barrier. This is the second Trump posture, and it is more revealing than a speech. He rejected Moscow's offer of a one-year voluntary continuation of the warhead limits, but his envoys were reportedly engaged in last-minute talks about continuing to observe the same ceilings after expiry. That contradiction is not a clever hedge. It signals that the White House wants the optics of restraint without accepting the binding architecture that makes restraint credible. It turns strategic stability into an informal handshake that can be reversed at any time. The institutional resistance here is procedural, not partisan. New START's one permitted extension was already used, so an arrangement to observe after expiry is not a ratified instrument, and it does not automatically restore inspections, notifications, or data exchange. Even if both presidents told their bureaucracies to cooperate, the verification machine cannot be restarted by slogan. Inspectors require agreed procedures, declared sites, rules for counting, and a schedule that survives domestic backlash and survives leadership changes. The destabilizing consequence follows mechanically. Once limits are voluntary, compliance becomes a matter of perception, and perception becomes a matter of intelligence interpretation. According to Reuters, experts warn that without binding constraints, each side is forced toward worst-case planning. Voluntary observation can slow a sprint, but it cannot eliminate the pressure to prepare for a break. A single announcement about new upload capacity or a shift in bomber patrol patterns can trigger budget pressures and force posture debates into the open. Trump's blind spot is that he treats observation after expiry as a holding pattern under his control. It is not. It is a fragile ceasefire of paperwork. According to Reuters, the Kremlin said it had offered voluntary follow-on arrangements before and complained the United States never formally answered. According to Reuters, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said Russia would remain responsible for strategic stability despite expiry, but he also described the end of the treaty as negative. That is a warning wrapped in diplomatic phrasing, not a binding commitment. Even the supportive headlines do not solve the central problem. According to Reuters, European Command said the United States and Russia agreed in Abu Dhabi to resume high-level military-to-military dialogue. That channel can reduce misunderstanding, but it cannot substitute for binding limits and intrusive verification. Trump's remaining options are narrow because the only durable fix requires legal structure, sustained diplomacy, and time. And time is the one thing his strategy keeps burning. Conditions are tightening, and the room for controlled outcomes keeps shrinking. The catch in observing after expiry is that it sounds like continuity while quietly stripping out the mechanisms that make continuity real. A treaty is a legal instrument with defined ceilings, definitions, and a verification method that produces shared facts. Observation after expiry is a political posture that produces only statements. According to Reuters, New START capped each side at 1,550 deployed strategic warheads, limited deployed delivery systems, and paired those numbers with short-notice inspections and routine notifications. According to Reuters, inspections had already been halted after Russia suspended participation in 2023, and both sides said they would stick to the numerical limits until expiry. That long period without full inspection already pushed the system into a gray zone. Trump's decision to treat expiry as a bargaining stage makes the gap itself part of policy. This is the miscalculation at the center of the episode. Trump appears to believe the numbers can be carried forward by habit while the law and verification architecture are discarded. That belief collides with how strategic organizations behave. Defense planners do not plan around vibes. They plan around enforceable limits or around worst case. Once a treaty ends, the institution that resists improvisation is the planning system itself, because uncertainty becomes a budget line, a production plan, and a doctrinal baseline. According to Reuters, experts warn that without a replacement deal, each side would be free to increase missile numbers and deploy more strategic warheads, though significant changes take time and technical effort. The not immediate clause is the trap. It tempts leaders to assume time is available for a better deal later, but procurement and warhead management are long lead systems. If planners expect a possible breakout, they begin the paperwork for upload capacity, for bomber conversions, for launcher reconfiguration, and for production schedules that assume the ceiling might not hold. The White House tried to buy itself a story. According to Reuters, Axios reported talks in Abu Dhabi aimed at observing the treaty's limits beyond expiration, and Reuters said it was unclear whether that observation would be formalized. Axios framed the idea as good faith, as a bridge to a new agreement. In reality, it is a bridge that holds only if both sides keep behaving, with no shared measurement to prove either side is still under the ceiling. This is where the situation becomes structurally adversarial for Trump. He is reactive because every next move depends on the other side's choices, and those choices are now obscured. According to Reuters, the Kremlin said the end of New START was negative and expressed regret, while saying Russia would continue a responsible approach to strategic nuclear stability guided by national interests. Responsible in this context means responsible by Russia's definition, not by a treaty inspector with a clipboard. According to Reuters, Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov said Russia would not be provoked into a new arms race after the treaty expires, while also saying modernization of Russia's nuclear triad was at a very advanced stage. That pairing keeps Moscow free to add capability while denying an escalatory intention. It invites a measured, deniable drift rather than a dramatic surge. And drift is harder for the public to notice and harder for diplomats to stop. According to the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, experts warned that a no rules, no inspections period opens after expiry, and the record already shows erosion in transparency, including suspended inspections and gaps in shared data. That is the institutional gravity Trump keeps underestimating. When shared numbers disappear, every actor substitutes suspicion. Legislators demand worst-case assumptions. Defense industries price in higher demand. Allied governments look for reassurance through their own hedging choices, because ambiguity is contagious. The third constraint comes from outside the U.S., Russia, dyad. Trump has argued for a new agreement that includes China. According to Reuters, China has declined participation in U.S.-Russia reductions, citing its much smaller arsenal. According to Reuters, when New START expired, China's foreign ministry called the expiration regrettable and urged Washington to resume strategic stability dialogue with Russia. The message is blunt. China will not join Trump's preferred framework, but it will use the collapse of limits as evidence that Washington and Moscow are on their own. That is how Trump loses leverage over time. He cannot force China into a trilateral treaty by letting the only bilateral treaty die. If anything, it removes the clearest proof that the United States can sustain arms control commitments. The result is a widening credibility gap. Allies hear the word observe and think informal, reversible. Adversaries hear it and think it is temporary, exploitable. Even the attempt to reopen military-to-military dialogue does not fix the core problem. According to Reuters, U.S. European Command said the U.S. and Russia agreed to resume high-level military-to-military dialogue. That channel can reduce miscalculation about near-term incidents, but it does not recreate the day-to-day predictability that treaty notifications and inspections provide. Dialogue tells you what someone says. Verification tells you what exists. So, observing after expiry means this. The White House tries to preserve the headline of stability, while the architecture that produces stability is absent. It dulls urgency in the public while sharpening urgency inside planning systems. It invites the illusion that Trump is managing the transition, while institutions quietly prepare for a more dangerous baseline. Trump's remaining options narrow to three unattractive lanes. Accept a voluntary observation regime and hope it holds, while critics argue he is capping the United States without enforceable reciprocity. Reject observation and treat the end of limits as leverage, while accepting that worst-case planning becomes standard across the alliance system. Or return to a binding framework, which requires time, technical negotiation, and political commitment. And it requires conceding that the easy drama-first approach was never a substitute for enforceable structure. In this episode, the treaty did not just expire, the illusion of control did. When New START lapsed, the immediate change was legal, not cinematic. The treaty stopped being a binding contract and became a memory of numbers. According to Reuters, the Kremlin said it viewed the end of the agreement negatively and expressed regret, while saying Russia would remain attentive to strategic stability. According to Reuters, China also described the expiration as regrettable. Those statements are not comforting. They are a signal that multiple capitals now see the same vacuum, and each intends to protect its own freedom of action. Trump's fourth posture is the reliance on ambiguity as leverage. He wants a new, better treaty, reportedly one that would bring China into the frame. But the institutions that matter do not treat ambiguity as a neutral holding pattern. They treat it as a risk premium. According to Reuters, experts have warned that without legally binding constraints, long-range nuclear forces become governed by worst-case assumptions. That is how budgets get written, how production lines get justified, and how congressional oversight fights get fueled. The technical reality is what makes politics harsher. According to Reuters, experts have said significant force changes would take time, but the absence of binding limits creates incentives to prepare for upload and expansion. According to the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, the pre-expiry period already included halted inspections and gaps in public aggregate reporting. When the baseline is already degraded, a voluntary observer posture does not restore trust. It asks the public to accept an unverifiable claim as if it were a binding ceiling. According to public reporting, the administration is forced to operate across three hostile audiences at once. Moscow wants freedom of action without being blamed for escalation. Beijing wants to stay outside U.S. Russia constraints while criticizing the vacuum. Washington's domestic factions want either an immediate buildup or immediate recommitment, and both camps can use uncertainty to attack the White House. In this environment, Trump's room to maneuver collapses into procedural choices. Every move triggers a new round of internal memos, allies' readouts, and adversary messaging campaigns. Even channels that sound stabilizing do not solve the core defect. According to Reuters, U.S. European Command said the United States and Russia agreed to resume high-level military-to-military dialogue. That can reduce misunderstandings in a crisis, but it cannot recreate the day-to-day predictability a treaty provided. Dialogue is reversible. Verification is durable. The institutional constraint that tightens next is allied confidence. A binding treaty is visible proof of restraint. A voluntary observation pledge is an invisible claim. According to the Council on Foreign Relations, the treaty's expiration arrives amid doubts among allies about deterrence, reliability, and it lands in a world where the UN Secretary General warned that nuclear risk is the highest in decades. Even if those fears stay quiet, they become policy. They drive hedging, demand signals, and quieter conversations about independent insurance. This is the negative consequence Trump cannot easily reverse. The end of New START turns strategic stability into an ongoing argument about intentions. Intentions are contested and evidence is limited. Trump's remaining options narrow toward accepting a legally thin observation arrangement and absorbing criticism, or embracing a build-up logic that makes a future treaty harder. The pressure is now structural, and it is not waiting for the next headline. Trump wanted the New START deadline to become a clean pivot. Let the treaty lapse, blame the old deal, demand a new one, and present himself as the only figure who can impose discipline on Moscow and Beijing. The public record points the other way. According to Reuters, he rejected Russia's offer to keep the core deployment limits for one more year. Then the same cycle featured reported talks about observing those limits anyway after expiry without legal formalization. That is not control. It is the White House trying to keep the language of limits after letting the law of limits fall away. The deeper failure is that Trump treated arms control as a headline instrument. Institutions treat it as an operating system. Once the system is downgraded to voluntary observation, every actor price tags the uncertainty. Moscow can modernize while insisting it is not racing. Beijing can criticize the vacuum while refusing to join a framework built for two much larger arsenals. Washington can fracture internally because ambiguity feeds both hawks and doves. Allies can hedge quietly because pledges are easier to reverse than treaties. According to the Council on Foreign Relations, the lapse arrives as allies question deterrence, reliability, and as global risk language hardens. According to the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, experts warn that expiry without enforceable rules creates both risks and opportunities. But the risk is immediate: reduced transparency and more room for misreading intent. That is the kind of institutional pressure that turns a president into a follower of the system. Observing after expiry is the catch because it can sound like stability while functioning like a temporary patch. It delays public urgency, but it sharpens internal urgency in planning systems that must assume worst-case outcomes. Trump's remaining options are narrower than the slogans suggest. A durable treaty path requires time, technical bargaining, and political patience, all while he absorbs the charge that he let the last enforceable limits die first. A build-up path invites the action-reaction cycle that experts warn can return once ceilings and verification vanish. If you want more investigations that track how power shifts under institutional pressure, follow this channel and keep the next brief on your radar.